Hello and welcome, everyone. We're going to give a couple more minutes for everyone to roll into the webinar and join us. Today, I'm joined by Dixon Jones and Jason Barnard. I will say a couple of more things about them a bit later on, and they will be our experts for today. And the topic for today is going to be 2 approaches to entities SEO. Now, search engine optimization used to be defined by the number of keywords and keyword synonyms across your website's content. When Google launched its knowledge graph, SEO shifted away from simply relying on keywords, and search engine crawlers began prioritizing rich snippets and entities on search engine results pages. These days, Google has more systems to identify the true meaning of keyword searches and queries. By categorizing ideas into entities, Google revolutionizes its search proficiency. While keywords are still important, SEO experts now also use entity-based SEO to further their ranking efforts. Context and relevance are becoming increasingly important in search engine results, and entities can help improve these factors. Now, this was sort of a brief introduction into the topic of today. Obviously, we're going to dive very deep into it, and we have 2 experts who are supporting 2 different approaches to entities SEO. So let me say a couple of words about our experts. In the right corner, in the red corner, let's say, we have Jason Barnard, who is the brand SERP guy. He is a digital marketer who specializes in brand SERP optimization and knowledge panel management. He is the founder and CEO at CaliCube, which is a groundbreaking digital marketing agency that helps clients optimize their brand SERP and manage their knowledge panel through the CaliCube Pro SaaS platform. Jason has over 2 decades of experience in digital marketing. He's a regular contributor to leading digital marketing publications such as Search Engine Journal and Search Engine Land, as well as a speaker at major marketing conferences worldwide, including Brighton SEO, PubCon, SMX Series, and YostCon. And in the blue corner, we have Dixon Jones. Dixon is a multi-award winning entrepreneur who has helped to build the internet marketing industry for over 20 years. He is currently an investor and CEO at Inlinks.net, which is the first entity SEO toolset built from the ground up around its own knowledge graph and NLP algorithms. Dixon is best known in the industry for building up Majestic, the link intelligence search engine, as a marketing director from 2009 to 2019. Now, before I give the word over to our experts and we start the discussion, let me say a couple of things to our audience who are joining us. So first, I already see that everyone's writing hi, so I'm assuming everyone can see and hear us, which is great. For the time being, guys, do not worry about taking notes. All you have to, we will send out a recording of this webinar, plus you can get it on our YouTube channel, plus we have a little something from our experts, which we will talk about at the very end. And if you have any questions, unlike our previous webinars and usual webinars, we will not have a Q&A session per se at the very end, but you can ask questions during the webinar. And we will gladly ask our experts questions as we move along through the topic of entity SEO. All right, so without further ado, let us get started on the first question from our experts. And the first question that we have for today is, what are the 2 different views on entity SEO? So let us start. I'm going to give the word to Dixon, if Jason doesn't mind. And
I do mind, actually. Let's start off with a bit of feistiness here.
I want a good, clean fight, guys. So
there you go, away there. Just wait in your corner. Wait in your corner. We'll be there.
I will. Sorry.
Firstly, Andrew, thank you very much. I thought that was a brilliant introduction. I think it laid down the path very nicely. So, I think what I'll do is explain my approach to entity SEO. And then Jason can explain his, and then the audience can decide on the differences and the nuances or not otherwise. But my approach to entity SEO is to consider everything in the world as being an entity. So a hill is an entity, walking is an entity, fitness is an entity, and when you put the idea of walking and fitness and hills together, then you probably get the concept of hiking out of those without even mentioning the concept of hiking. So my idea of Entity SEO is to try and look at the relationships between those different ideas. And for us at Inlinks anyway, it's fairly straightforward in that an entity is something that's got a Wikipedia page. Almost. There's some exceptions, but that's our simplistic mind technology. It's not that simplistic, but it's we've built our knowledge graph around the relationships between all of the different pages on Wikipedia. And then it's a case of, okay, now we've got a different view of the world based around ideas. So how do we then dive in and market in a world that's based of concepts like that? So that's our approach, really, from the ground up, of ideas like walking and hills and hiking and stuff like that, and then building it up into making money out of that in search. And Jason's approach, I think, is a different way of looking at the same problem. But over to you, Jason.
Right. I mean, yeah, I mean, what you're saying is fine and it's true. I mean, I think people would probably understand it better if we said topics. Topics are entities, and things within the topics are entities. The thing about the word entity is I think it scares people. And I start with a simpler concept, which is you as a person are an entity. Your company is an entity. Your CEO
company is an entity,
is an entity too. Your products are all entities. So they're things that we can name and we can point at. They're also topics, as Dixon said. So it is actually both, but I tend not to deal with the topics. I let people like Dixon deal with that because it's too vast for me. I focus on saying, who am I? What do I do? Who is my audience? Once I've defined that, I then try to explain it to Google. I educate Google. Google is a child. Google wants to understand the world like a human being understands the world. And the way it does that is through its knowledge graph. It's through entities and relationships, which is how our brains function. I, Jason Barnard, know Dixon Jones, two entities, relationship is knows, or today, fights. So that would be two entities with a relationship. And Google is trying to understand the world. It wants to understand which Dixon Jones am I talking about when I talk about Dixon Jones in an article, which Jason Barnard, and how do they know each other? Why are they related? And if I can build up Google's understanding of who I am, what I do, and who my audience is by explaining it to Google, getting into the knowledge graph, getting Google to understand me, my products, my company, and my audience, who my audience might be, I'm going to win the SEO game, because Google is trying to match its audience when they search with the correct answer. And if it understands what my answer might be, it can correctly match my answer to the user.
So if anyone, hopefully those two different approaches make sense to the audience. If not, ask us what we explain wrong, because I think the difference is we think the difference is it's not, we're not fighting each other really, but we do have a different way of dealing with entities, and a slightly different approach. And
well, I mean, I would simply argue that basically, from my perspective, I'm saying if Google's understood who I am, me the person, me or my company, then I can start building your topics on. So if you're an expert in walking in hills, for example, which isn't particularly complicated as a thing to do, not wishing to insult you and your hobbies, but
I found it very hard last week.
If it understands who you are, then it can start to understand the topics you're authoritative for. And if people have heard about EAT, expertise, authority, and trust, it needs to understand who I am, to understand what I'm an expert in, what I might be authoritative in, and then if it can trust me to actually serve its user when they ask a question. So obviously I want to be an expert and an authority in brand SERPs and knowledge panel. And by the way, a brand SERP is what Google shows your audience when they Google your brand name. And I think it's phenomenally underestimated in both the SEO world and the marketing world. And that's my 2 cents.
I think we're going to come on to those topics and entities and that relationship pretty quick. So I won't carry on. Just I'll go back to Andrew and let him follow up if needed.
So thank you guys both for your answers, for your approaches to the first question. We already have a couple of questions from Jamie. He has a question: what is a knowledge graph?
Ooh, yeah, I said that. Sorry about that. Oops. And Dixon, I think it was you who said, I mean, I've heard it multiple times. A knowledge graph is basically an encyclopedia that's readable by a machine. So instead of getting the encyclopedia out, it can just pull this information out. And the thing you need to know about a machine is, although kind of as humans we've got good memories, it's got the encyclopedia in its brain that it can access in real time incredibly quickly. So, I mean, would you expand on that? It's an encyclopedia for machines.
There's three distinctions that you need to be aware of. Jamie, the difference between a knowledge graph, which is exactly as Jason's described it, the knowledge graph, which is Google's version of a database of ideas, and a knowledge panel, the knowledge panel, which is the thing that Jason's really hot on, which is kind of what you see in a brand SERPs on the box on the side. And but I absolutely agree that a knowledge graph is really a database of ideas, and I see it as an online encyclopedia. Wikipedia is a great example. Wikidata is a good example. In my presentations, I have a picture of pints of beer on a wall and different brewing techniques and some things. And I found it in a poster in a pub, but it's a knowledge graph of beer based on the images that are in there. So a knowledge graph is literally is literally a sort of a database of concepts.
And you mentioned the knowledge graph, which actually Google kind of commandeered the term the knowledge graph. But in fact, Microsoft have one, IBM have one, Facebook have one, Amazon have one, Twitter. They all these tech corporations have a knowledge graph, and they're all building a knowledge graph because they all need to understand the world in order to be able to actually serve the users. So they're all looking for this quasi-human understanding of the world.
Good question.
Thank you. Let's move. We have another question from Tracy. So is she getting this right? So the idea is, who am I? What do I do? Who is my audience? Are all things that specify your entity?
Yeah, sorry. Well, that's what I'm basically saying. You need to communicate to Google. The entity is, who am I? What do I do is what Dixon's talking about, which is my topicality, where I'm expert. What do I offer? What can I offer the audience? And who is my audience is just me communicating to Google through those first two pieces of information, who my audience might be. Which subset of Google's users is actually my audience? And that's a really interesting distinction between users and audience. Google's users, there is a subset in there that is my audience, and I want to make sure that Google can isolate that audience and present me to them when I am appropriate. So who am I is the entity, what do I do, and who is my audience is the SEO you build around that entity. Oh, I like that.
And I think mine actually moves exactly the opposite way for that. So it starts with, who is my audience? My audience are the people that like hill climbing or and all these other things. That helps me define what it is that I do, and and writing that up and putting content that feeds my audience then helps define who I am as an entity. So I'm kind of working from that end to that end. Whereas and the reason I did that is because I wasn't really seen as a very influential entity, and that was hard for me to tell Google who I am. I didn't just come in and suddenly be authoritative on a particular subject. And also what's really annoying is that if I'm going to be doing that for 4 or 5 different clients, I can't be the same thing to other people because it's going from me down. I need to be able to help the customer's audience go back to who the customer is. So I see it as left to right on your question, and whereas I think Jason is tackling the problem from
the other side,
left to right. I'm right to left. Yeah.
Right, yeah. But I mean, you could actually say you can tackle it from right to left. I tackle it from left to right, and we meet in the middle, and everybody's happy.
Absolutely. I mean,
one doesn't exclude the other.
Just so we all know, Jason and I go back a long way, and we sort of discussed this. In fact, we were sitting on a bus going around, going back from Brighton SEO when all the trains messed up, and went through this just a few weeks ago. So, we've spent a long time learning from each other on this, I think.
All right. I like the idea that we are coming from different, completely opposite directions, but we will meet in the middle one day, Dixon. We'll meet again, as the song says.
Okay. Well, I'll buy your services.
Thank you.
Okay.
The chat keeps rolling, so we have.
That's fine. We can abandon the rest of the questions then.
So we have 2 questions from Rita. The first one is, how does Google use entities? And the second one is, how does Google detect entities? So
right. Can I go for the use one first and give my really simplistic visual example, which is what Dixon said earlier on the knowledge panel. It uses entities. It understands entities. It presents the knowledge panel on the right-hand side on desktop. So that's a really simple representation of how Google uses entities. It goes way beyond that, and Dixon's going to explain that part, I think. How does it detect entities? It's up to you to educate it. Once again, it's a child. It wants to understand, and our role as the responsible adult in the room is to educate it about our little corner of the internet. Our little corner of the internet is me, my company, my products, my website. So I need to educate Google. That's how it detects entities, because it will crawl the web, and it will probably, and this is something quite interesting, as John Mueller was saying, they use a term called reconciliation. It's basically got lots of fragmented information about things, and it can't make sense of them. It can't put them all together in one piece. So imagine it's just got a broken china plate, and it's trying to put it all together, and it's looking at it, it's going, I'm not sure that's right. The idea for detecting an entity is there, but you can actually help it by presenting it with the finished plate. On your site, you say, this is the finished plate, this is what I'm talking about, this is me, this is all the information about me, basically your CV if you're a person. And it then has something to compare its fragmented or rebuilt fragmented version to that is in fact correct. So that's a way to build an entity in Google's brain. And once it's built it in the brain, it will show it to its users in the form of a knowledge panel. That's what I love. That's my special talent. Dixon's got other special talents. Have you not?
I love that. I love that. And there's a couple of other ways that Google uses entities before I come on to the detection bit. Two that stand out for me is one in the picture world, which is slightly off of Dixon and Jason's main thing, although connected. If you type in a picture into Google, it comes back with, or type in a word into the picture search, it'll still figure out everything. So it's understanding what those pictures are about. It's understanding the entity behind those pictures pretty effectively, and it's using entities to do that. You can also see entities in Google Trends, but it uses the word topics. And Google, Jason's absolutely right. This word topics and entities, Google has used the phrase topics a lot when I think they're talking about entities. Unfortunately, they all use the word topic when they're not talking about entities, just to muddy the water for us. And I'm sure that's not intentional, but it's there. But you can see in Google Trends, when you start typing something, sometimes you'll see search term as a definition, and sometimes you'll see topic as a definition. And I was doing a presentation today, and it said something about eruption, funny storm types or something like that. So it's got different types of topic as well. So you can see those topics in Google Trends. How does it detect it? Well, in text, it detects it through what's called they used to call it a natural language processing algorithm. They've now used it to say natural AI in their documentation, but essentially it's a named entity extraction algorithm, which basically reads text, and it understands that when you say search, it probably means, well, when you say engine, it probably means automobile if it's got the word car around it, and it probably means a search engine if it's got the word search before it and stuff. So it can work out the difference between those words based on how it reads that page, and it will break every page down into sometimes hundreds and hundreds of entities. There is a Google NLP API that you can use, and it will show you which ones it thinks are most important. But Google's NLP API only really brings back the obvious ones. It's really good at bringing back brands and places and names and things that start with a capital letter. It's not as good at bringing back concepts like hiking or hill walking, and so that's where it needs some help, and that's where we can come in and help Google to fill in those gaps.
Which is a delightful explanation, and it's really, really, really good. One thing I would add is that you're really pushing towards this idea of understanding. We're back to understanding. Google wants to understand the meaning of the text. It wants to stop counting keywords and understand the meaning. And so kind of from an SEO perspective, I've been in the SEO industry for 23 years, and we've been counting keywords because that's what Google was doing. Those days are either they're over already or they're about to die. And it's now time to start thinking in terms of entities and helping Google to understand. It's reading the text like a child would, understanding the text like a child would. We need to help educate this child.
Thank you.
Love that, Jason.
Yeah, but we're going to take two more additional questions.
This isn't much of a fight, Dixon.
I think the concepts and the approaches were definitely a different approach. But the thing is, it is a meeting in the middle of it's two ways to crack an egg.
Thank you very much. I was scared about what you were going to say. I think that is really nice. We've met in the middle very quickly, so this is going to be very peaceful.
So, and another follow-up question from Rita, the person that asked the previous two. So, does schema.org play any significant role in entities?
Okay.
In helping?
Can I go first on that one?
Yep. Go ahead.
I think that it does, and we're banking on the fact that it does a little bit. So, what we do with our own natural language processing algorithm or natural AI or whatever Google wants to call it, or we call it, or named entity extraction algorithm. Basically, it's reading a page of text. We read it ourselves. We break it down into the underlying concepts and ideas. Then what we do is we ask a human, the customer, to then say which of these ideas is really the important idea. We've got a good idea. We've got them listed in what we think is important, but we tried to automate it and it all went horribly wrong very, very quickly. So we decided to stop and allow the human to put in the most important concept for this page out of all the ones that we've seen in the list. And then from there, we can immediately say, right, okay, these are the most important things on the page. These are the prominent ones on the page, and we've got to include the one that the customer's put in. And so we can put in about schema saying this page is about mainly this entity and this entity and this entity. And for us, an entity is referring to something else that it can understand. So we say, so this entity is the same as this Wikipedia page over here for hiking. But you could put in, it's the same as this IMDb reference to a person, or it could be all sorts of other bits and pieces. And Jason has a much bigger list of data sources that that he believes Google is using, and he's been tracking that very well. And that's certainly, you know, a strength of Jason's CaliCube Pro system, that he's got all these other data sources in there. But this being able to map an idea to a concept that Google already understands in its database suddenly makes it very easy for Google to jump in and say, okay, now I get what this is about. Because there are a lot of ideas on the page, and you're turning it from explicitly asking it to be about these, implicitly hoping that Google will understand the main points, to explicitly saying what the main points are. We don't have definitive information that Google is saying, yeah, we understand that, and that's absolutely fine, and this is exactly how you're supposed to do it. Because it doesn't appear in a rich snippet, it's not part of Google's, schema documentation checking. But we do know they read it. We do know that it's part of the system. And our evidence has shown that if you do that kind of schema combined with internal linking around that as well, and you make the internal linking sensible and logical, then that can have a profound effect on Google's understanding and what Google thinks is important about your page and its authority. So that's my answer to that one.
But that's a really good point. And I think kind of the idea of schema markup is just for rich snippets is short-sighted. It goes way beyond that, and it's what you're saying. It's supporting evidence. If we come back to the child again, I love this analogy. Yeah. The child has read the page. It thinks, probably understood that. I'm maybe 40% confident I've understood. What we then do with schema markup is re-describe the important points of the page, sometimes some details that the child might have missed, or that we haven't actually put in the page, some small details about sizes of shoes or whatever it might be. And we give it to the child in its native language. Schema markup is Google's native language. So we feed the supporting evidence. So the child goes from 40% reading this really boring history textbook to 80% confidence because we gave it a bullet list. And that is the power of what Dixon's doing with Inlinks, is providing that supporting evidence, that bullet list for revision for the child to support its learning. And you were talking about sources that Google uses to corroborate information. The word corroborate is quite difficult for me to say, but I do love it, so I'm going to keep saying it.
Yeah, but to be fair, you speak 2 languages very fluently, and probably 4 more as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, just 2. I've lost my train of thought. Where was I?
Sorry. Corroboration.
Corroboration, yes. All the sources that Google uses to corroborate this information are incredibly important, because if we come back to the child again, you have just explained it. You are the authority on yourself. But let's say you're the parent, the parent in the room. If the child goes out and sees the same information repeated by the headmistress, the teacher, the policewoman, the baker, the grandmother, the sister, and it's all repeated in the same way and it's the same message, the child ends up being incredibly confident in its understanding. And we have this concept for me with Google is understanding, confidence in that understanding. What Inlinks do is bring extra confidence, and that's really powerful. What Kalicube does is explain.
Yeah. What you just said, I mean, I don't know, maybe we're going a little bit too far for the webinar, but it also creates this this danger in society. If we start to over educate the child, then the child starts to believe something that potentially isn't true, and that can happen. You can have incorrect Wikipedia information with a bit of propaganda from somewhere around that builds up a narrative which may not be true, or there are two versions of a narrative that are both true, and these ideas are fighting it out in a knowledge graph as well.
Yeah, I mean,
vaccination, great one, really. Without going into the pros and cons of vaccination, there are two schools of thought on the issue, shall we say?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I mean, for me, that's pushing things kind of, yes, you're 100% right. And it is incredibly complex and it's philosophically difficult. What I would say from my perspective at Kalicube Pro, what we're doing is saying, if you want Google to get the facts straight about you, it's up to you to educate Google about the facts about yourself, and make sure your explanation dominates, that you're providing that plate that's been put back together so that Google has something to compare it with. If you don't do it, Wikipedia will do it, IMDb will do it, the newspaper will do it, the Sun newspaper in the UK will do it, and it will be rubbish. So if you want to have any kind of control over how Google understands you, it's up to you to go out and make sure you're educating it.
I've seen how Kalicube's back end can give you that eyes, so you can suddenly see how places on the internet have misrepresented you, and maybe they didn't misrepresent you, but life's changed. You used to be a musician, but now you're an SEO guy. You used to be a cartoonist, but now you're an SEO. And that's what happens. Life changes, which means you change, and if you don't communicate that out, then the world's going to get a confused view of you. Yeah,
brilliant.
All right, thank you. We have a lot more questions, and we're going to take one more before moving on to our prepared questions that we want to discuss during the webinar. So we have
these ones better. These ones are better. The customers' questions are better.
Yeah, I'm thinking we're going to probably do the Q&A. We're going to have more questions for the Q&A than for the official one after we covered.
Oh no!
So we have a question from Bill.
Right.
Are you all busy? So are we all busy building our own private knowledge graphs that combine together into a universal knowledge graph? Is that basically the idea?
Well, firstly, I would say that Bill Slawski is somebody that if the two of us were going to say one person that we probably shouldn't argue with, then it's probably Bill. So I'll just put that out there, really, that this question probably comes with an opinion on Bill's end first. But Jason, do you want to try and go?
Well, I mean, once again, we're all responsible for our own little corner of the internet, and we need to build, I would advise people to build an internal knowledge graph where things are clear in your own mind. I think when I sit down with customers at Kalicube Pro, first thing I notice is people don't actually understand what it is they're talking about. They can't organize it in their brain. They do it so naturally as a human being that they can't iterate it into something structured that a machine can understand. So the first thing is to go through it and say, what am I talking about? What's the company? What are the products? What are the attributes of the product? What is it I'm actually offering, and how's it all connected together? I build my internal knowledge graph, then I communicate it to Google if I want Google to then help me by ranking me and sending me traffic. At which point, once we've given it to Google, or we've provided the information to Google in the form of schema markup and a well-structured site and great content with great context in the pages that the NLP can get a good grip on in the first place, then we're allowing Google to integrate that into its knowledge graph. We're providing it with knowledge. But I think one important point is that we control the information we provide. So in building the private internal knowledge graph is incredibly important to what I'm obsessed about, is controlling the message, controlling the facts, because Google is going to get it wrong if you don't do it.
So I've been looking at this question as it's gone there, and then just letting it sink in.
You were playing for time.
I was definitely playing for time, because the thing is, a private knowledge graph really depends a little bit on your definition of a private knowledge graph, really, because I think that Google only accepts some data sources either for convenience, accessibility, or authority. And then, and leaves others. And sometimes it will just take some records, it's particularly keen, or was particularly keen. I don't know how the world's moved on RDF sets. So basically sort of semi-formatted structured data. So it liked things like IMDb and Wikidata and Wikipedia, because they were already semi-structured and it could work on those, and it knew that there was a sort of some human element into to modifying those, and so that was great. So a knowledge graph that's being built like IMDb or by Wikipedia, it makes sense for Google to use that, because it can get a lot of information quite quickly, and it can have a reasonable level of trust, although it may not trust all of it. On the other hand, a website is arguably a knowledge graph. If it's well designed, it's a knowledge graph of everything that you're an expert in. So you could say the pages in a website are a knowledge graph if you've set it up saying this is the page about this, this is the page about this, this is the page about this, and then yes, that becomes a private knowledge graph that combines together to make what we call the World Wide Web, which is a much bigger knowledge graph of web pages. And so in that context, absolutely, we're all busy building our own knowledge graphs to combine together to make a universal graph. Where it gets a little bit more confusing is what data sets Google is using outside of web pages and Wikipedia databases and things like that. And there's no reason why they couldn't be taking song lyrics and all sorts of other ideas and then feeding it into this knowledge graph, because as you say, as Jason says, this knowledge graph is static, is held on their own solid state servers, and is there. And even if your website goes offline, they'll still have the answer to the question as a result of connecting those dots.
And talking about the sources that Google's using, I mean, the Calicube data, the data set we've got, 70,000 brands, so it's not massive, but it's big enough to actually get a good insight, is what we're seeing in knowledge panels is the attributes. We can figure out what kind of source it was, and there are basically 4 different types. And the 2 most recent are what Google are calling web facts and open knowledge. And these are both crawled from the web, and they actually reference some of them. It's about 90% are not cited. They don't actually say where they got it from. 10% are cited. And you can see it sometimes. I saw one earlier on, it was the Indian Times. Saw another one, it was the company's own website. And that's obviously the what do you call it? The golden
Holy Grail.
Holy Grail, thank you very much. Is that Google is pulling the information into your knowledge panel and into the knowledge graph of these attributes, facts about you from your own website, and it's just been corroborated by other sources. And that's something we're looking into in quite a lot of detail. These web facts and open knowledge facts have gone up from 6% in knowledge panels to at least 14% in the last 6 months.
This also makes the biggest danger for, and it's about the SEO part of Entity SEO, is it's not, feeding the knowledge graph is relatively easy. Schema tells that information to the knowledge graph, and you can feed that information in. But if it's open source information, that you've not necessarily made money out of it. The citation back to your website, or not necessarily to your website, but to your ecosystem, it could be your Facebook page, it could be your Twitter profile, it could be something that you control, or the flight between London and New York, which you only have the route to, but whatever, it's got to feed back to something that you can profit from, however you define profit. Otherwise, you haven't done any SEO. All you've done is given away your knowledge.
Right. I mean, what I'm focusing on is saying I need to control how Google understands me, because if it doesn't understand me, it's all going to go horribly wrong. So the foundations of my house fall apart, and the entire SEO strategy falls apart if it gets the basic facts about me wrong. And so kind of that idea of the golden cup thing was more about saying I want to control how Google understands me, my entity, and my company, and so on.
Yeah, no, I understand. And ultimately, if it understands you as relevant in a perspective, then in a vertical, in your business space, then they will get back to you. So that's it will get back to you. All roads will lead to Rome.
The big problem with Calico Pro is I can't actually measure any financial gain. All I can say is you're avoiding disaster.
I love that. Well, it's a good place to start.
Scaremongering. Sorry, Andrew.
Before it came on, in the eyes of eyes of the blind, in the world of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to one of the questions that we had prepared beforehand. So is Entity SEO about becoming an entity or about becoming an authority on a topic? And we will get to all the questions that we did not answer later on, guys. Just don't worry, we will get to them. And please, Jason, would you start with this one?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really obsessed about becoming an entity. I mean, my mindset has I agree with Dixon. The topic is incredibly important to build on top of this foundation. I'm focused on building foundations because building a foundation for a house is such an important job that you need to spend the necessary time to do it. And if I start looking at the walls and the decorations and the doors and the windows and so on and so forth, I won't be focused on the foundation. So I focus on the foundation, and I would hope that Inlinks would then build a beautiful house on top of my super solid foundations with their authority on a topic.
I think the interesting thing on this question is that I think that the word topic and the word entity are synonymous with each other, and frankly, they refer to the same entity. Topic, so they are the same thing. So the question then becomes: is Entity SEO about becoming an entity or becoming an authority on an entity? And that becomes an easier question to sit there and say, oh, okay, I see. Because of course, yes, you are an entity. Jason would argue, and he's absolutely right, that you are an entity whether Google sees it or not. You don't not exist because Google hasn't noticed you yet. You are an entity, and he's absolutely right. And then from that it's so what does this entity mean to the world?
Yeah.
But becoming an authority on an entity is kind of where I like to sort of look at it, and then hopefully I will then become an entity that is representative of this authority or topic, but it still meets in the same place. It's just different ways of getting there. So I think it's both. It is cracking the cracking the egg from both ends. That's a mixed metaphor, isn't it? But I do think that the word entity and topic are largely can be seen as synonymous and meaning the same thing, and sometimes that's helpful to bear in mind.
Yeah, I was actually about to say, well, so therefore I'm a topic, but in fact I am a topic.
You are.
Yeah, no, absolutely delightful. I'm a phenomenally interesting topic if you ask my mother and my wife or my daughter, and phenomenally uninteresting if you ask the taxi driver from earlier on who drove me back from where I was.
Yeah. And as a topic, you have relevance in some circles and not in others. And I even before the interwebby came along, I used to talk about Bill Gates being very authoritative on operating systems, but less authoritative on pop music. He has no relevance in the world of pop music, and so for him to be argued as an authority on pop music would be absurd. He's an authority on operating systems, enterprise software, and now the Melinda Gates Foundation. But he's certainly not an authority on pop music, as far as I'm aware.
All right, thank you. The third question that we have prepared is similar, and I would like to take this opportunity to address it before we take some questions from our viewers. So what is the difference between an entity and a topic?
Okay. For me, nothing.
Okay,
not always. That's not always true. But basically, I think that a topic, when Google has its documentation, it's using the phrase topic because it's more convenient for people to understand. And Google doesn't like to talk in terms of what the scientists have used when they've got, or what the researchers have used when they've been writing all this stuff. They'll probably use entities in patents and things, but they'll use topics in just explaining concepts to to us as what they would see as human beings, as opposed to, you know, machines. But I think there is a big overlap between the two.
Right. And Jason will.
Yeah, I mean, there's a big overlap between the two. As with most things in life, the lines are quite blurred. I would tend to still focus on myself, my company, my songs, my products, my music albums, and my music group, which is what kind of I've been building my little experiments on, as entities, and then link them up to topics, simply because it's easier for me to communicate to my clients and easier for me to talk to other human beings about. Because for me, the entity in my brain, at least, is something solid. It's a named entity, something I can actually kind of point at, whereas a topic is much more philosophical.
Yeah,
so
I can as
for
well.
the sake of clarity.
I can as well, because for me, I just sit there and say, if I can see a Wikipedia page on it, it's an entity. If I can't, it's not. And I know that that's not Google's knowledge graph. Google's going to have loads of other entities all over the place, and definitions and other ideas and concepts. But a lot of those will be very, very similar to each other, or different ideas around the same sort of concept. Obviously, people are not listed in Wikipedia, and organizations are mostly not listed in Wikipedia, and they've got all the Google My Business and things. But nevertheless, when trying to get a view of the world, if it hasn't got a Wikipedia article, then it's probably quite a vague concept still.
Ooh, well, I mean, I would actually suggest that, I mean, Wikipedia is tiny in terms, I mean, once again, as you said earlier on, it isn't because Wikipedia hasn't recognized you that you're not an entity. You're maybe not notable, which is one of their kind of rules. And so I would suggest to people, the fact that you're not in Wikipedia, you're not notable enough to be in Wikipedia, or even Wikidata for that matter, doesn't mean to say that you're not an entity. It doesn't mean to say that you cannot explain to Google, educate Google, who you are, what you do, and who your audience is, which is, for me, the foundation of the house that you are building using Inlinks, which is the SEO strategy of topicality around me and where I can serve its users.
I absolutely accept that. What I would say is that all the ideas in Wikipedia put together in the right order should be enough to define who you are. So if you can say that I am about this, and this, whether it's I as an organization, or whether it's I as a product, or whether it's I as a picture, I as a thing, concept, I'm about this, and this, and this, should be enough to describe what you are as an entity.
Right. Thank you.
Which makes sense to me, but only in my crazy little mind.
But we have a question from Massimiliano. So the advantages of an enterprise level knowledge graph is clear, but what about a site level knowledge graph and a topic modeling approach to content strategy optimization instead of a keyword based one?
Can I go there?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what an enterprise level knowledge graph, but it's nowhere near as adept or changing or updating as Google or IBM or Bing, but it's enough for me to get a view of the world and connect some dots. But then we can use that to then look through, with a natural language or named entity extraction algorithm, your own content on your own website, and very, very quickly build a knowledge graph of your website. And it's really interesting when you see that, because you make the knowledge, and we display it in we display it in a list form, and we display it in a wheel. Basically, start seeing all these topics in human resources, and then another bunch of topics in marketing and advertising, another one in software as a service or software, and so different business models will then tend to have emphasis in different verticals or different areas of market sectors as well. But you can your topics, and then in the list format, you can see how important those topics are as well. So yes, this is absolutely what does is it starts by building a knowledge graph of your content, and then we compare that to a knowledge graph of competing content.
Right. And one thing you said there was joining the dots in your content, which I found really interesting, because I was talking to a client earlier on, and a lot of people still count keywords. How many times do I have to repeat this word? How many synonyms do I need to put in? And the answer is basically none. If you mention it, and it's relevant and the context is correct, it's gonna make sense to Google. And then if you join the dots for it using a tool like Inlinks, it's really going to explain to Google. It's going to give it that supporting evidence. But the most interesting thing is when you give that to a client, they actually start thinking, what am I talking about? And they suddenly realize that they start joining the dots, is that the dots don't necessarily join together as well as they had thought, and that their writing wasn't clear, their writing wasn't explicit. And rather than counting keywords, they would have done better focusing on where the content is actually focused, where it's going, what they're explaining, and keeping it on topic.
There's a French SEO, Laurent Borelli, that keeps on saying, look, you should be able to take out your keyword out of your content altogether, or black it out, and even without it, it becomes really obvious what the page is about. I was dubious about that the first time he said it, but the more I sort of see it, the more I understand what he's saying. It should be obvious what your site is about, even if you don't actually mention the word. It should be obvious. And Google wants it to be obvious, not necessarily using the word at all.
Right, to continue off of your answers, we have a question from Tracy. So how can she transition from keywords to entities? Do you have any tips on how to make the switch?
Do you want to go first, Jason?
Well, I mean, I personally speaking, what I find the problem is that the concept of entities is quite philosophical and complex. The concept of counting keywords is really simple. So people kind of hold on to things that they can actually deal with really simply. And the first step is to understand what an entity is. It's a thing or a topic. And the second thing is to look at your content and identify, it's what Dixon was saying earlier on, what is this fundamentally about? And what are the topics and the entities that it's mentioning that create the context that really nail what that article is about? So joining the dots using a tool like Inlinks or another of the tools out there is, for me, an incredibly important exercise. And it's very frustrating. And for the first weeks, maybe months, you'll be struggling and you'll be having bad dreams about it. But after a while, it gets easier. And after a while, it becomes natural. And then you end up being able to write great content that speaks to your human audience and that is still understandable to Google and that doesn't have that awful keyword repetition and awful synonym stuffing that we all hate so much when we read it, but we do so much as SEOs.
Yeah. So I'd answer. I mean, I agree with everything that Jason's just said, which was not the important. I was trying to argue with him, but there we go. But I'd say, you transition by just taking a little bit of a step back from what you're trying to do. So if you're looking at a page of, let's say you want to be top of the world for banana splits. Then really you find all the authoritative or a bunch of authoritative pages of content on banana splits, all the things you're supposed to know. So that could be the top 10 pages that are already ranking for banana splits. It might be the research articles on how to make banana splits or recipes or whatever. But you've decided, for whatever reason, that these are the most important bits of things that are about banana splits. Then go through them and sit there and say, right, they're discussing this. Bananas, they're talking about plates, they're talking about growing palm trees, they're talking about this or coconut trees, or etc. So you're breaking it down into the underlying concepts, and then you start to, in that process, then realize that a plate and a bowl are synonymous in this context. There's no point in using both. Basically, you've got to put your banana split in a bowl or a plate, and it doesn't really matter which one you put it in, but it's the same thing. You need a receptacle, you need a recipe, you need a banana, you need to get the banana from recipe to plate. So you think you're breaking that all that text down into the underlying entities, which sound very similar to keywords, but they're not, because you're reducing you're taking away a load of the noise. You're taking away all the synonyms are all the same thing. Plate and bowl in that context are the same thing. They're doing the same thing. So you don't need to mention both in the article. You just need to say you've got to put it in a bowl or a plate.
Thank you. The next question is from Donna, addressed to Dixon. So how do we still, do we still use key phrase research to help determine demand for a topic, then look for related entities on that topic, generate more detailed content, including those entities? Is that a yes or a no, roughly?
You
I
can.
don't think. Right.
You can. I think you've asked me to give a yes or no, and I hate saying it depends. So in some contexts, absolutely. There is a certain demand for the phrase Eiffel Tower, but if you take that literally, fine. And there's also a demand for the German equivalent of that, and there's also demand for that big pillar in Paris that's made by some guy called Eiffel. All of those are the same thing. They're describing it. So a lot of the times, particularly with brands, the phrase is very, very clear and very, very well defined. And there are very few synonyms. In other concepts, hiking and walking, does it really matter? It's the same concept, or could be depending on the way, in which case you might find that Google will return results with walking in the titles and descriptions rather than hiking in the title and descriptions, even though the users typed in hiking. And so the reason that I'm spent so long waiting for that is because Google spends some time with the query before you get involved. So Google is sitting there saying, when somebody says, where's a good place to hike? What do they mean? Do they mean the same as where's a good place to walk? Do they mean in context to where they are located? They come up with all sorts of other bits and pieces and come up with a framework of understanding the query, and then they'll match what their determination of that query is. So they've used entities to understand the user query before they give the results, and that didn't happen in the old days. Google would just match keywords to keywords. I hope. Right. I got away with not saying quite yes or no without going to it depends.
Yeah, I think Donna's going to let it slide. So we have another question from Rita. Google offers two types of research on its trends tool: search by search term, i.e. by keyword, and search by subject, i.e. by entity. So how can I differ from the two to have a great result?
Okay, so I've used that quite recently. So it's not got a subject, it's got search by topic, where it's got topics and things. What I would just say is that if you're going to use Google's trends tool to compare things, make sure that you're comparing like with like. Don't compare the trend on a topic with the trend on a search term. So you can use either. If you're still in keyword world, fine, use search terms. But ultimately, I think topics will live out, and I think when you say subject, I think you mean topics. Sorry if you're seeing subjects and I'm seeing topics, but I think basically, as long as you're comparing topics with topics, fine. I would rather we build a future based around comparing topics with topics, because I think that's the future of search.
I mean, one interesting thing to add to that is if you build around keywords. I mean, I remember back in the day when you would create one page for each variant of a keyword. So we would build a page for kid game, another one for kids game, another one for kids games, and another one for kid games. So that was 4 pages for 2 words with plurals or not. That was phenomenally boring and tiresome. Then we ended up counting keywords and aiming at specific keywords. Now we're in a situation where if you're talking about a topic, you can get really lovely surprises because loads of traffic, loads of visibility on Google coming from things you hadn't necessarily thought about, because Google isn't just looking at the words, it's looking at the context and what you're actually talking about, and it's matching, the user's intent, what they're actually looking for with what you're actually offering in a human-esque sense. And for me, that's what's really interesting about this new frontier, is that we're going to get some lovely surprises if we're working with entities.
Yeah, for keywords you didn't know that you were optimizing for, and that can be a lovely surprise. Of course, you're going to need search engine ranking to be able to spot them, but they're there, which is good.
Great. Another question from Donna. So it's easy to understand in theory, but she's struggling to understand how to execute this. So she uses Inlinks to discover related entities, but then how to actually implement them or use them in a sensible way in content.
Okay, so we also we do have a suggested content structure or possible structure to say, well, if you put them in this way, mathematically you'll be joining the dots quite efficiently. But I think that's currently rubbish, and I would like to work on a much better one. But and I think also it becomes important for Brain 2.0 to get involved. The fact that you can see that your competitors are talking about all these different topics doesn't always mean to say you should, because you can suddenly have 4 people are all talking about Twitter, and that's because they've all got Twitter profiles on the pages or something like that. So you can find things out of context to the meaning, and also your business may have a different business model and therefore will be differently nuanced to other ones in search results. But the principle remains the same: is you want to connect those ideas in sensible, logical stories. So the idea I put in my presentation of this poster with types of beer on it and all the beers being connected with lines, so I have amber is a color, which is the color of lager, and lager is a type of a pilsner is a type of lager. So you then kind of connect the dots by connecting those ideas in a logical, sensible way, which are telling a story, which hopefully is a correct story and a true story, although there are definitely AI systems now that are trying to write that for you, and they're interesting, but a little they're a little dangerous. But connecting those dots in sensible stories helps to create a story that will educate the user down the depth of knowledge of a topic. So it's giving you the topics. Putting them together still requires either Brain 2.0 or putting it into a automatic create text out of this that sounds meaningful. I reckon that the latter, I thought for a long time, I thought initially, as soon as Google sees that, it's going to ban you from the search results. And then I kind of got the other angle and thought, well, you know what? You could say the same about Grammarly. Grammarly is just is machine improving content as well, and I think the truth has got to be somewhere in the middle. You can't rely on machine making all the content for you, but then that's exactly what Google does when it comes out with the rich snippet answer, or especially when Mum gets involved, the complex query algorithms. Then they're coming up with complex answers to complex questions. The one that they put in their documentation is, I've just climbed. I got the mountains wrong. I've just climbed Kilimanjaro, and now I want to climb Mount Fujiyama. What do I need to do to prepare differently? That's the one that they put in their documentation, and they want to be able to answer that. That's a complex question that is not answerable under today's technology, but they're using AI to try and achieve that purpose. So it becomes difficult if Google are going to go that far to then automatically automated content writing. Of course, I hope for humanity's sake that for quite a long time, humans can do a better job of taking that content wherever it comes from and doing a better job of educating the user. But that's where the magic of the content writer is, and that's why the content writer is going to be important regardless of the tools that they're using.
Great, thank you. So we are basically in round 10 because we don't have that much time left. So we're going to focus on the questions that we have prepared beforehand, and then with the time that we have left, we'll address all the questions that we have left. Okay, so how can a brand become an entity? That is
right. Well, the brand is an entity whether the brand likes it or not, and whether Google recognizes it or not. The question is, does Google understand it as an entity? Does it understand enough about it? And the process is incredibly simple. I wrote an article on Search Engine Journal that explains the process, and it's a 3-step process. And the funny thing about it is that it fits into a featured snippet, and you don't even have to click through to the results on Search Engine Journal to get the 3-step process. The 3-step process is entity home, corroboration. Entity home, clear description, and corroboration. And basically, the idea of an entity home is very, very, very powerful. And I think this applies to any entity, a person, a company, a product. Google is looking for the place where it can reconcile the fragmented information I mentioned earlier on. And so basically it's looking for the authoritative source, which is the entity itself, to explain who they are, what they do, who their audience is, with that plate put back together correctly. Then it can reconcile that information. So you create this entity home, which is one page that represents the entity, and Google will then look to for its reconciliation. You then describe the entity incredibly clearly, and incredibly clearly doesn't mean just writing your CV or just writing the history of the company or whatever it might be. It's actually sitting down and thinking, what am I trying to explain? And explaining it simply and clearly to a child. You add your schema markup in the background, and then you reiterate this information in the form of schema markup, Google's native language, and then you point to all the corroborative sources online, be it IMDb, Wikipedia, Wikidata, Crunchbase, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, your government websites or authoritative websites within your industry, and they should corroborate what it is you're saying. So basically, you go out, you go to those sources, you correct the information to make sure it corroborates what it is you're saying on the site, and you would be astonished at how rubbish the information out there is, how fragmented it is, and as Dixon said, things change over time, and how you've let that slip. So you correct all of that, and then the machine gets this same message from all of these authoritative sources. It's got the fragmented plate, it puts it together, it compares it to your version. Bob's your uncle, Alison is your aunt, you're an entity in Google's knowledge graph, and you get a knowledge panel if you're lucky.
And I'm just going to say that I've seen John Muller corroborate exactly what Jason has said on Twitter, citing Jason, saying this homepage idea, that everything he's just said there. I'm going to say I shouldn't be putting words into John Muller's mouth, but I think that I've seen John corroborate that on Twitter, more or less.
Great. All right. So let's move on to the last question that we have prepared, and this one is going to be mainly for Dixon. How can a brand become an authority on a topic? This is more
okay. So that for me, I know how to tackle that when I started Inlinks, because Inlinks, of course, only started 2 or 3 years ago. It was completely. It didn't even have the .com, which I am a bit annoyed about, frankly. But I was handed Inlinks as a frame, and we had to start creating an entity around that. And the way that we approached it, and the way that we've succeeded in doing this, I think, is to continually show insight that is ahead of the game. So here's a way of looking at it, which I've just put into presentation. I haven't presented it yet, so sorry, Growth Festival, that I'm leaking this one out now. But Tesla, who's the guy that does Tesla?
Elon Musk.
Elon Musk started making electric cars way before there was a market for electric cars. Way before anybody, everybody, Top Gear was sitting there taking the mick by showing it, running out of battery halfway around the track. People were laughing that there wasn't any engine in there at all, but he stuck to his guns, and now he is they have it. Meanwhile, now you're here. Now we're all starting to buy electric cars, particularly in the UK, by the way, because we haven't got any petrol right now, because it turns out we're not allowing any HGG drivers into the country, which is crazy. We're now all buying electric cars. Elon Musk is already onto the next game. He's now already into space tourism. He's now already talking about getting people into space. He's getting his foot in the ground of a topic before the topic becomes top of the zeitgeist. So that's the true way of doing it, is to be able to see ahead of time where you need to be, so that you just happen to be there when the rest of the world catches up. That's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is to play catch up, in which case you're going to have a much harder job. But the reason that Jason and I are now seen as, thank you for inviting us, authorities around entities, is because we started there first. We just were there first. We were there trying to do it along with Bill Slawski, trying to understand all this stuff, and people were spending a lot of time trying to catch up, or thinking, well, tools will come along later, or when it becomes important, Google will tell us, or whatever. No, as soon as Google bought MetaWeb, the owners of Freebase, it suddenly became obvious that it was going to be at least a meritocracy-based approach for Google, a fundamental change in approach, which may or may not have worked, but it was a big gamble for Google given the amount of money they apparently spent for MetaWeb. So they were really going to go for it. And it did take them a long time for these two competing ideas of keywords versus entities to fight with each other. But ultimately, entities are going to win out now. There's no doubt about it. So, so becoming an authority on a topic after the fact basically means you've got to add, you've got to play catch up with all of the expertise that's already out there, and something else, and something new, and ultimately doing the first bit is 80% of the work. That last 20% though could take 80% of the time.
Right, and I'd add to that: produce quality, correct content around your topic, and be recognised by your peers and appreciated by your audience. Simple as that.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you. So let's take a couple of more questions before ending this. Unfortunately, we have time is of the essence here. So we have another question from Massimiliano. Publishing data on the linked Open Data Cloud (LOD) makes sense in order to represent a site as a knowledge graph, right? Is that correct?
I don't know.
Well, I'm not an incredible expert on this either. What I would say is, once again, we're looking at corroboration. So if you are pushing your data out onto the Open Data Cloud, it becomes a corroborative source. Now, what I found really interesting about corroborative sources, especially in the knowledge graph, is that a lot of it seems to be just self-fulfilling. So it's this self-fulfilling prophecy that you're saying about yourself, and then you go and say it on your Twitter account, your LinkedIn account, you push it out to the Open Data Cloud, and perhaps you edit your Wikidata page, you push it out to Crunchbase, and in fact, you've controlled all of that information, you've edited all that information yourself, and Google ends up believing it. So a lot of this is actually just reiterating what you've already said on your entity home. And one thing we've noticed with CannyCube Pro is the most powerful ones, the most powerful corroboration, the most powerful reiteration of the facts are those done by a third party. That's where you really want to go.
Great, thank you. And we have a couple of questions, comments from Bill Slawski. So people creating schema markup are subject matter experts pointing out what is important when developing schema for specific topics to teach Google what information is available in SERPs. So that's phrased as a question.
I don't even understand the question.
I think it's not a question.
Okay. I would say people creating schema markup are hoping to define the content on their own content. So I think they're trying to. I see it as schema markup turns your site from a jumble of topics and ideas into a star of concepts and ideas, where it's really clear where the authority in your site, and only in your site, is for each topic. So if you get that wrong, you completely bugger up your own world, basically, because all you're trying to do is say, I'm not pretending I'm better than anybody else. I'm saying that that this is the place that's about this thing. This is the place that's about this thing. This is the place that's about this thing. And that's using about schema and content schema. There's a load of other types of schema, which I'm not an expert on, and all of them are relevant for rich snippets and goodness knows what. But when it comes to about schema, that's what I'm trying to do, is I'm trying to combine that with internal linking to make it obvious within my ecosystem, within my personal knowledge graph, or my site's knowledge graph, if you like, where the authority is on any topic. I'm not pretending that that the rest of the world agrees with that, or that that outside of this world, that might even not be true outside of the world, the ecosystem. That's a more complex problem. But if your whole website is about aeroplane flights, and then you've got a page about prices, then there's context automatically in there. You're not talking about prices you're talking about prices in the context of airplane flights. But if you're talking about price comparisons of shoes on a completely different website, prices have a different meaning. So to me, schema markup helps make your content more obvious, not better.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, from my perspective, schema markup in the entity home example that I always use is basically reiterating what you've already said in the page. Google's probably understood it. You're reiterating it in Google's native language, so it builds that confidence in its understanding. And also with same as in particular, you point out to the reiterations around the web that confirm what it is you're saying. For me, I'm really, really interested and intrigued by this idea of Google is looking for understanding and confidence in that understanding. And the more confident it is, just like a child, the more it will go and shout it out in the playground. And shouting out in the playground, in our context here, is putting it on the SERP. So a child, when it's not confident, will tend not to say what it is they think they've learned. Once they're confident, they shout out in the playground for everybody to hear because they're so proud of themselves. Google is a little bit like that child in the playground, and shouting out on the SERPs is the equivalent of the playground.
If you're not lucky enough to have a knowledge panel, of course, and then you want to try and update it, then Google asks for corroborative evidence, so which is the same as schema, really. So it's trying to ask for a third party bit of information that it can use to corroborate that. And then it may or may not accept it, as Jason knows about my own knowledge panel. Humans can accept it, then the machine just says that.
Well, I mean, from a knowledge panel perspective, I think that's a really important piece of information. Is you claim your knowledge panel, you can submit corrections. A human being at Google will look at it, but they do ask for that corroborative information that actually confirms to the human being that what you're saying is true. They can change it, but ultimately the machine decides. If the machine goes out there and it finds information that contradicts what it is the human has put, it will just switch it back. You've had that. I had a client who came along who had the wrong book in her author's knowledge panel. They changed it. The machine just switched it back a week later. So a little bit off topic there, but knowledge panels, trickier than they might at first appear.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And Donna has a sort of a question that will sum everything up for hoping for her. So is it about connecting schema plus internal links equals a knowledge graph of my site's ecosystem, right?
I'm happy with that.
Is that Dixon's approach, or does Jason also give a thumbs up to this?
Yeah, no, I was just about to say Donna is going to be the next invitee for the next webinar. I'm going to get fired.
All right. I think we're gonna leave it here. I just want to show something that Bill wrote. It's not a question. He's just using this to get more eyes looking at him. He's just putting a question at the very end, which is actually a statement. So writing about entities is like telling the truth. There's only one story, and you don't have to lie to tell it. That is what he wanted to contribute. All right, and I just wanted to bring something up on the screen to finish things off. So obviously. Dixon and Jason know a lot about SEO, and we're not even putting their social media or anything up there. You just have to Google it, because everything they do, it can be easily found just by looking for their name. And if you have any questions, just reach out to them regarding the topic, and let us know if you have any questions for us as SEO ranking. You can always reach out to us as well. And also, as I promised, we have a little link from Inlinks, Dixon's company, so you can follow this.
It's hidden under Bill Slawski's message there, but just go to inlinks.net/p/demo, and if you want a demo of Inlinks, you can sign up to a calendar there, and with one of the guys and guys and girls, and they'll take you through the system and show how it works. I hope. And I have to say that we do find that people that don't do the demo tend not to get it. People that do the demo get it. It doesn't mean to say they buy it, but it does mean to say that they get it. So it's worth doing half an hour just to get your feel your way around the system.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
for connecting with me, just like to give my equivalent of that link is just search my name, Jason Barnard, on Google. That's basically my business card, and it gives you a list of all the places that you can connect with me on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on YouTube, on Facebook, on my own site, on my company website, and you can learn all about me in my knowledge panel. And for me, kind of that's the conclusion. The brand SERP guy is, that's my business card. I don't need to tell you where to find me. I can allow you to search my name and you choose where you want to connect.
Great. So wonderful. This was very interesting. Just guys make sure to rewatch the replay, and because it's a complicated topic if this is the first time you've heard about it. So make sure to check it out. And if you have any additional questions, reach out to our experts. And thanks again for joining us. Thank you, our experts, Jason Barnard and Dixon Jones, for doing this with us. This was amazing, and I hope to do it again in the future with you guys.
Thanks a million. Thanks, Dixon. Lovely fighting with you. Thanks, Andrew.
That was good. I enjoyed that a lot.
I think it's a tie. I think we're getting the results in right now. Yes, and I'm being told that it was a tie. So there's going to be a rematch at some point.
Brilliant. Wonderful. How delightful. And I would have done a bell. Ding, ding.
Oh, I don't have anything, but yeah, we're going to put in the sound effect later on for the replay.
Brilliant. Wonderful. Thanks a lot, man.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for watching.
Bye.